At CSIS this May, Her Excellency Minister Miriam Almahiri looked ahead to COP28 and said, "We want to make sure that food systems and climate resilient agriculture are front and center stage along with the energy dialogue." She noted that food systems are a huge problem, but also a solution to combat climate change. According to press from Dubai, COP28 has put food firmly on the agenda this year. Minister Almahiri herself said that food systems will be center stage in all future COPs. Today, we look back at COP28. What was agreed? What was committed? And what does this mean for climate, agriculture, food security, water security, and nutrition everywhere? I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the CSIS Global Food and Water Security Program. In partnership with the UN International Fund for Agricultural Development, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's public event, reviewing COP28 outcomes for food security. We are so pleased to have assembled an expert panel to dive into these issues with us, including Dr. Cary Fowler, the U.S. Special Envoy for Global Food Security. Cary is joining us today from London. Satu Santala, Associate Vice President for External Relations and Governance with the UN International Fund for Agricultural Development. Satu is joining us today from Rome. And my own colleague and friend, Noam Unger, Director of the Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative at CSIS. Noam is joining us today from Washington, D.C. Welcome to each of you. With our panel, we will zoom in to focus on some COP28 outcomes in specific, and we're also going to zoom out to address trends across the conference in Dubai. We have a lot to get to, so we will turn to our discussion shortly. But first, I want to note that once our panel discussion concludes, we will welcome, and in fact, we very much encourage questions from our audience, and you could submit your questions at the Ask Questions Here button on our event page. And without further ado, I will start with a question, first for Cary and Satu, and this is about the atmosphere that you encountered in Dubai. Most of us were not at the conference. In fact, Noam and I were not there, and a lot in our audience weren't there, of course. And so for our benefit, can you describe the atmosphere that you encountered there? And in a few words, can you describe the framing of agriculture and food systems among COP deliberations? And we'll start with Cary.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks to CSIS for convening this. I guess the first thing to say is that Dubai is a strikingly modern city with incredible architecture like you won't see anywhere else in the world almost. It was a very, very large conference, probably larger than anybody online has ever been to. I think there were 85,000 people there. So you can imagine not everybody fits into the plenary hall. Not everybody, thank God, was involved in the negotiation of the final document or even could witness those negotiations. So, in some respects, it was really a conference of multiple conferences, many different things going on in a very, very large venue, many different buildings, and people coming to the conference frankly, for many different reasons. And like a lot of conferences, perhaps much of the important work was being done in the corridors and in the side meetings and such. I guess the other thing to say is that like almost all conferences of parties to treaties and UN meetings, the final decisions were made by consensus. And that sort of means that nobody got exactly what they wanted. It wouldn't be something that any of us would have drafted, but consensus, I think, in this context means something you can live with, something countries can live with, not their first choice, perhaps. So, in terms of the framing of the discussion, it was obviously the first time that food and agriculture was highlighted in a UN meeting, and that's really important if you follow UN and treaty negotiations. So I'll leave it at that. We're going to dive into those issues, I'm sure, but it was a first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Satu, I'll turn to you with the same question.
Thanks. I think Cary has really well described the kind of multiple realities of that very, very large climate conference that was happening. And I think each one of us could only kind of be part of some of the conversations. Of course, there's been a lot of coverage then, so you kind of try to understand other realities there too. But I do think that at least, you know, in the encounters I had, there was a lot of excitement about the fact that food systems, agriculture was highlighted so strongly and was brought to the table and to the discussions. Of course, it should be considered just the beginning. There's a lot of more work that needs to be done, and in particular, of course, we would like to continue seeing that adaptation and food security also continue to be a key part of those conversations. Yeah. But I do think that, you know, we really, I think we can really be, I think we can congratulate the UAE presidency for actually doing this and putting forward the declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action, which was still signed by 134 world leaders. So it's a significant step forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. Another question for each of you, and it's about expectations for this COP with regard to agriculture and food systems, expectations versus achievements. And there was a lot of excitement going into this COP for the way that it would address these issues. And I'm wondering for you, do you think that COP28 delivered in this regard, or do you think that it fell short in important ways? And it sounds like that answer could differ depending on who of the 85,000 people you ask that question to, but I'll ask that from each of your perspectives. First, Dr. Fowler, and then to Satu.
Okay, you're right about that. Depends on the perspective. You know, for a long time, there've really been two pillars, or let's say two silos in the climate community, I think, mitigation and adaptation. If you were in the mitigation camp, and I'm stereotyping here, but if you were in the mitigation camp, you saw agriculture as a big problem. It's a greenhouse gas emitter. If you were in the adaptation camp, you saw climate change as a big problem. It's going to be difficult to adapt to climate change. I think that if you're in the global food security camp, you're able to, in a way, see both the mitigation problems and potentials and the adaptation problems and potentials. In other words, I think you can see the whole picture. So I guess the first thing I would say about expectations versus achievements is that that's not the same thing as hopes versus achievements. Our hopes are always larger than our expectations ought to be. And in this regard, like many UN and convention meetings, words matter. How issues are framed matters, because those words convey legitimacy, how you can discuss issues and what kind of evidence you can bring to bear. And they shape the discussion, and they even shape or influence the delegate composition. So if you look at the final declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action, I have it here. You see that it recognizes the challenge of climate change to food production. It talks about the importance of agricultural production. I'm very happy that it speaks about the importance of agricultural research and development, including using science-based innovations. It talks about soil health and fertility, which I'm very happy about. It also, parties agree to integrate agriculture and food systems into their national adaptation plans, which is significant. And I think it's also important that it highlights the role of women and smallholder farmers and nutrition. All these are important. So if you think of COP, any COP, as being not just a final destination, but as a process along the way, then I think COP28 was an essential step in that. The declaration, which I mentioned, I think is now signed by 159 countries. It acknowledges both sides, if you will, the mitigation and the adaptation side in relation to food security. It makes those connections. The test of the achievement of COP28 is really going to be what you mentioned in your question. It'll be what happens at COP29 and perhaps at COP30 and the lead up to COP29 and COP30, and what happens in the G7 and the G20 meetings, and all the steps that we're going to take to get to those two next big COPs.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thanks for that important reminder that COP is not necessarily a destination, but a process, and it's a step to the next COP and the next and the next one. Thank you for that. Satu, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, just maybe building on what Cary spoke about. I think, from IFAD's perspective, it's also not the end destination, but also none of the COPs actually are. It's what then happens based on these talks and these sort of decisions that then turn into action in the real world that actually truly matters. So for us, I think this was an important step. It was also a sort of an important building block for future action. I think what was important was that there was involvement of different players, including civil society, private sector, because we really need to sort of holistically bring everyone to the table. We also, from IFAD side, of course, we continue always to advocate for smallholders and rural poor in the developing world, and it was reflected in the outcomes, and of course we will continue to need to put that on in the forefront. Where I continue to feel that the world collectively has not achieved enough is really adaptation finance, and within the adaptation finance, finance for food and agriculture, and then still within that, the share that goes to smallholder agriculture, and there was a new research that was published just ahead of the COP that says that share has actually gone down, and it's now 0.8% of climate finance that reaches smallholders in the developing world, who are very important guardians of our food systems. So therefore, that's something that I think still needs further work. And then just finally, from our perspective, then linking what is talked about at the COP, and then how does that link into the real world? We are right now, this was the year that IFAD is in a replenishment, and we were actively thinking about tools just to bring that precious climate finance to the smallholders and to the rural poor. We've developed some new tools, including what we call climate additional contributions, where we try to attract climate finance so that we can channel it forward. And we did see quite a lot of support from our member states for this, as well as our replenishment that we finalized last week.
Okay,
so.
Great. Thank you, Satu. We will turn to some of those some of those issues, to IFAD 13, and also to your roles in Assembler of Finance. But before we do that, I wanted to turn to my colleague Noam Unger. Noam, I'd like to ask you that same question, but from the perspective of climate adaptation. Hopes were high for attention and outcomes about climate adaptation at COP28. And from your perspective, did COP28 deliver? And in what ways did it fall short of expectations?
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks for having me be part of this conversation. I want to start by saying I agree with some points that Cary and Satu made. It's very important that food and agriculture were really highlighted for the first time in the ways that they were in Dubai. And I also agree on the point about COP not being the destination, but it's really about societal and industrial shifts and how the COP discussions actually help broader society get to those shifts. So taking a step back in response to your question, it really is important to recognize that adaptation is an issue on the rise. So it's increasingly important for global alliances and for moral and economic and security interests. And there's a just tremendous demand that is growing from countries, especially across the global south, for increased attention on adaptation, to points Satu was making as well. So, where we are is we've had these ambitious mitigation goals as laid out in the Paris Agreement, and they are sadly and increasingly seemingly slipping out of reach. But notably, even if we do achieve these ambitious goals, billions of people will continue to be dramatically affected because they live in contexts that are and will continue to be highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and climate-induced hazards for decades. And that's even if we meet our mitigation goals. So even if we hit these targets, that we're not on track to hit, climate change impacts are really already bad, and they're going to get worse. So in that context, adaptation really is a growing issue on the agenda. That was reflected in a big way for the first time a couple years ago at COP in Glasgow. and then in Egypt last year. And so coming into COP28 in Dubai, there were high expectations for something, especially for something called the Global Goal on Adaptation, which was originally developed coming out of the Paris Agreement, and then was the focus of a 2-year work plan over the last couple of years. And that was meant to develop and agree upon a framework for more specific attention to and approaches for adaptation. So adaptation covers a lot of different issues, from climate information services and the development of early warning systems to building climate resilient infrastructure and providing different innovative kinds of insurance. And this is important, especially, for example, on the climate information services. About 1/3 of the global population, including 60% of people across Africa, don't currently have access to or the ability to avail themselves of early warning systems and climate information services. So adaptation is more broad than this specific discussion on food security and agriculture, but it absolutely encompasses so many of the relevant issues, as well as water and health, and, as I said, infrastructure. So it's really about averting and reducing and addressing climate change impacts, as opposed to trying to avert climate change as a whole, which is what we're talking about on the mitigation side.
Yeah.
There was an early sort of quote unquote win at COP in Dubai on loss and damage on a climate impacts fund, which will be for at least several years housed in an intermediary fund at the World Bank and focused on climate impacts. But that was very much negotiated in advance of Dubai. And the global goal framework negotiations really got caught up and somewhat foundered under the weight of some of these tensions around climate finance, as Satu was talking about, and also about the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities, which we could get into. But it really very much about how China views itself on the global stage now versus back in 1992, and there are a lot of issues there. But overall, climate adaptation issues were, while there was, so many of the 85,000 or so people were having vibrant conversations about these issues, and that's wonderful. From a coverage perspective, sitting in Washington, looking at what was happening in Dubai, they were once again overshadowed by mitigation issues because of a history-making official acknowledgement of the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And I'll note that making history has perhaps never had such a low bar. But adaptation issues are on the rise, and they're also on the rise within what the US government is trying to do and the leadership it's trying to show. And that's something that I tend to focus on. And we could talk about that in the President's emergency plan.
Great. Thank you, Noam. Thank you for helping us to zoom out and look at the topic of adaptation outside of agriculture and food, including those things, but beyond those things. So thank you, and we'll return to a lot of those issues later on, no doubt. But I had mentioned that we're going to be zooming in to look at some particular initiatives, then zooming out to be looking at trends across COP. I'd like to zoom in to look at VAX, Dr. Fowler, to look at the vision for adapted crops and soils, which we had the pleasure of helping you announce here at CSIS in February of this year. It was a very successful COP for VAX, with Secretary Blinken announcing $50 million in new funding for VAX. A few days later, an additional $10 million in new funding for VAX. Can you help us understand the ways that this funding will help to achieve broader US goals, US and COP28 goals about climate and agriculture? And then we'll talk about that. Then I want to talk a bit about Aim for Climate, but first let's talk about VAX.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Caitlin. And you're right. I was going to mention we launched VAX at CSIS in February this year. Thank you again. Well, VAX deals principally with crops and soils, and it deals with mitigation and adaptation. So on the soil side, certainly we know that good, healthy, fertile soils are necessary if you want to have drought tolerance and resilience to the kind of climate shocks we have. So there's an adaptation element to that. But it's also necessary if you want to have agricultural systems that can use fertilizer efficiency. We want farmers to use fertilizer to increase production, but we don't want them to use it unwisely and wastefully. And that, sadly, is what's happening in many parts of the world. That's bad. It leads to a lot of other knock-on issues, such as water pollution. So on the soil side, adaptation and mitigation are absolutely part of what we're trying to help achieve, focused on Africa in the first instance. On the crop side, also adaptation and mitigation, but primarily adaptation, I would say. We're perhaps making some assumptions about how easily our crops are going to adapt to higher temperatures and more extreme weather and more extreme and more incidents of extreme weather and such. We can't take that assumption. We shouldn't be accepting it. We focused on traditional and indigenous crops in Africa, looking at ways to improve their production, simply because they add so much. They have so much potential for adding to nutrition in Africa, and it's that potential that we want to unlock for food security, in the future. We know, frankly, that if our agricultural systems don't help to mitigate climate change, we're all going to fail. On the other hand, if agriculture doesn't adapt to climate change, we're also going to fail. So we need to be able to do both. And I guess our message from the U.S. government is that we need to take care of the fundamentals. Our Secretary of State says that if we don't get this right, if we don't get the crops right, the crop adaptation work right, we don't get the soils piece right, if we don't get this right, nothing else really matters. And that's a blunt statement, but it's true. That's where we're coming from. And that's where we want to work with IFAD and other partners to try to address those really fundamental problems.
Yeah, well, thank you. And congratulations again on your successes at COP28. I'd like to turn really briefly to talk about another initiative that for the US government is centered at the State Department in partnership with USDA. But this is Aim for Climate, the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. It was announced 2 COPs ago in Glasgow. It's a joint US-UAE initiative. Can you tell us a bit about its large successes out of this last COP?
Sure. Well, I think, Aim for Climate is really getting a lot of attention these days, and as it should. Personally, I think it's a fantastic idea. It's an initiative that's co-sponsored by the US and UAE, which seeks to identify really game-changing kinds of innovations and then publicize those and crowdsource in funding to implement them. It's got many partners. I don't know how many, but it's a lot. Private sector, nonprofits, governments, etc. Our VAX initiative has just been made one of the Aim for Climate initiatives, so we're happy to be formally associated in that way as well. I think it's something we should be looking at and supporting, because we need those kinds of innovative approaches. And as we've been saying at the State Department, so much of agricultural change, transformational agricultural change, is going to have to start with innovation. And we collectively in the international community haven't been putting the kind of resources that are necessary into research and development and work historically. We need to change that, and Aim for Climate is a good start.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that summary. I will turn to Satu because I'd like to zoom in to talk about some of IFAD's successes at COP28, and also just a few days ago as IFAD's 13th replenishment cycle just wrapped up. But let's talk about ARCAFIM that IFAD launched and related initiatives, and also want to talk about IFAD's role as an assembler of finance. So lots of prompts there. Go ahead.
Thanks, and lots to talk about. I'll try to be brief. First of all, just wanted to also thank the US and Dr. Fowler personally as well for your leadership on putting together the VAX, and IFAD will be hosting the trust fund and sort of bringing a lot of this work then to practice in the coming months. So we're very excited to be part of that work. But yes, another initiative that we launched and that has created a lot of interest and excitement is called ARCAFIM. I have to look up I always forget, Africa Rural Climate Adaptation Finance Mechanism. But what is cool about this this platform that it brings together different financiers with a blended finance risk sharing facility together with a technical assistance facility. So there's concessional finance, there are guarantees from the Green Climate Fund, there's technical assistance grants from a few donors, And then there's private sector investment from the Equity Bank. It works in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And it's really private sector climate adaptation, which is quite, I mean, putting together blended finance platforms, believe me, is quite difficult to do. And then doing it with smallholders, small businesses for adaptation is not very often that you see this. So this is what we've been able to do to launch now. And we expect that it will catalyze up to 700 million in investments to this work. And at the same time, I think it shows well what kind of a role IFAD can play, really, as we call ourselves an assembler of finance, but where we bring our skills and our finances, but then together with a significant number of other finances, and then our role is really to bring it then to the smallholders, to small businesses, and sort of make sure that it really reaches where it needs to reach and that it is professionally run. So that's what we are doing, and of course look forward to report back on when implementation is well underway. And this is a part of what we put forward also for our member states for our new replenishment period. So that role of being an assembler of finance, where the core resources that our member states give in our hands to manage, then we leverage them in many different ways, but also use our own resources as sort of building these types of partnerships where we can really be bigger than our own balance sheet is. We were very excited. We had our last replenishment meeting Thursday and Friday last week, and we had a record-breaking outcome. This is the beginning of our pledging. We're still going to be seeing some more coming in, but we were already able to gather 1.1 billion in commitments, which is more than double compared to where we were last time. So it's great. And we're really well underway for our record-breaking replenishment, which is extremely necessary and needed right now, given where we are globally and given the need to really invest in that resilient agriculture and rural development that we work with.
Okay, thank you. Well, congratulations again on the success of your 13th replenishment cycle. And I believe it was announced that the U.S. government gave the largest donation of any, largest bilateral donation with $162 million over the next 3 years. So congratulations again.
Excellent, and thank you so much for that. We're really grateful for that leadership. Thank you.
Great. So I do want to turn to some questions from the audience in a few moments, but first I want to turn to another aspect of COP28, which is something that is perhaps inevitable for a conference that is addressing so many different issues involving every country around the world, 85,000 people on the ground, and that's the controversy that ensued around discussions about agriculture and food. And a lot of the headlines were about meat and dairy. So for example, one of the headlines, big meat and dairy lobbyists turn out in record numbers at COP28, with this being perceived as an attempt to turn COP28 outcomes in favor of these industries. And I actually want to chat with Noam about this. Noam, what's your interpretation of the controversy or perceived controversy around the participation of these industries at COP28?
Well, yeah, I mean, in fact, so the same story has actually been amplified as well in terms of fossil fuel industry organizations and oil companies. So with regard to sort of big dairy, big meat, I think all of this is a sign of, in some ways, the COP is a victim of its success, and it's to be celebrated. I mean, the reality is that these multinational corporate entities recognize that there is a lot at stake in these negotiations, and that means that the negotiations matter. And so if you want your negotiations to matter, you have to sort of accept that it's going to draw a lot of interest from many different stakeholders. And going back to the point that I was making earlier, we need to make industrial and societal shifts, not just agreements among sort of politicians. And so you actually want many of these stakeholders to be a part of the process over the years and to be brought along and to shape it. And so that's how I view it. I understand that there's controversy, but in some ways I see it as a good sign of progress on the agenda. It's not just something that is marginal that a bunch of policy wonks are over here talking about.
Certainly, and what could be perceived as controversy through one set of eyes could also be perceived as necessary involvement of the private sector in a lot of the changes that are being discussed at COP. I'm wondering if Cary or Satu, do you have anything to comment on with regard to this perceived controversy at a COP28? That's fine. I will be. Yep. Thank you. Well, thank you, Noam, for taking that question. I will turn now to some questions from our audience. And building on this, I want to dive in a little bit about meat and alternative meat production. It seems that, this is a question coming from Washington, D.C. from an audience member watching here. Recent UN reports suggest that perhaps opposing recommendations regarding meat and alternative protein production. Some parts of UN perhaps suggesting that lower levels of traditional production of animal protein are necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Other parts of the UN system suggesting that increased meat production is necessary to improve nutrition among people around the world. So I'm wondering, how do we square the needs for sustainability in the animal egg system with the need for access to healthy diets is the question. Dr. Fowler, when it looks like you might.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yep.
Well, I think we have to start from a position of humility, frankly, and a position that recognizes that we have multiple food systems around the world, all of which are evolving, adapting in some way. We see obviously a need for improved nutrition in developing countries. I think the latest statistic I saw was that 84% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford a nutritious diet. This is a fundamental problem that we need to address and are trying to address through our VAX program. Obviously, everybody's going to have to get their agricultural systems in line with some overall goals, but I think we really have to recognize that those systems are at different places in their development, meeting different kinds of needs, facing different kinds of challenges, and we have to allow for some room for maneuver and planning in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. Satu, how about you? Anything to add there?
Yeah, very much agree. And I think while in some places, yes, absolutely, alternative protein sources would need to be really very much the focus, or let me rephrase, some places will need to think about much more of transitioning away from animal production, whereas others, that's really maybe not the first thing to think about. But at the same time, for example, in our work, there's quite a lot of opportunities for increasing the variety of plant-based proteins and sort of enhancing nutritional nutrition through other means. So it's not an either or question really, but it's everything at the same time. But really thinking about where and who are we talking about and what the priorities and needs are.
Certainly, or rebalancing is the way that the UN FAO is characterizing some of the shifts that need to be happening. So thank you for that. Another question from our audience, someone based in Washington also. This is about water and food. And this question is, with this year's World Food Day highlighting the linkages between water and food, did you get a sense of increasing coherence between the challenges to water and food security at this year's COP?
Well,
Dr. Fowler, but yeah, thank you.
Quickly, I'm not sure. I haven't been, frankly, involved terribly substantively in the water portion of this, but what I've seen in my work at the State Department has been I think the increasing willingness of people to look and see and work across the different silos that we come from. I think the VAX program that we have on crops and soils is an example of that has sort of united the soils people, if you will, with the crop people, with the climate change folks, and with the nutritionists. As much as you think that should be just business as usual, it's never been business as usual. So when we come to the water issue, obviously there are some things that one can do in agricultural systems, and I know IFAD is involved in this, that very specifically can help with water. But there are also actions that one can take with crops and crop adaptation, and with soils that help with water, and vice versa. So I think, finally, we are breaking down some of these, I would almost say, ideological barriers to collaboration between the different kinds of disciplines and getting somewhere.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Satu, looks like you're agreeing there. Yeah, great.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, wonderful. And that actually gets to another question that I've seen come in. This is about collaboration. And Noam, I'd like to actually address this to you. It seems that collaboration is emerging, or at least it's always been there, but maybe it's being even more emphasized as a preferred way to achieve a lot of the goals that are pledged at COP. So can you talk about the importance of collaboration, both with regard to some COP level outcomes, but also maybe US, so global level outcomes, and maybe US initiatives to help achieve them, like Prepare, which I know that you've done a lot of work on.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the declaration that my colleagues were talking about in terms of this COP with regard to food security and resilient agriculture and the like. And that was the US and the UAE. There are a lot of things that happen at COP that are not part of the main sort of UN negotiating process that are, as Satu was talking about, drawing, more than 130 countries to sign on to it. And I think that that's what you're seeing more and more is these sort of, there's the main process, and then there are also these coalitions of the willing that sort of glom on to certain issues and really push them into the spotlight. And I think that that's happening more and more. This COP was definitely an example of that. But to your point, or to part of your question, Caitlin, another part of it is collaboration within the US government. And Dr. Fowler rightly was talking about the collaboration that is instilled through the VAX approach. And I mentioned the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. And this is something that was announced 2 years ago at Glasgow, has been developing since, but it's run by State Department and USAID, but it cuts across 19 different agencies of the US government to focus on these issues of climate information systems, early warning, health, water, food. And I think having these structures, going back to the last question as well, having these structures actually helps to push a breaking down of the silos. So to push those who are focused on water and those who are focused on food and ag to really consider the others in these processes through these collaborations. I think national adaptation plans are another example of that. And this is part of the formal process through the global goal on adaptation, really expecting and anticipating that countries will come forward with their own national adaptation plans, and having those planning systems actually helps to break down some of these silos as well and encourage greater collaboration.
Yeah, that's a great point. Satu or Cary, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'd love to add something there. And I think what I'd like to say is if the US government wanted to have a project called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, VAX, we could do that. But we didn't do that in the beginning. We started off VAX as being co-sponsored by the African Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and we quickly added in as a key partner IFAD in Rome. Since then, since the launch in February, we've committed a fair amount of funding, but so has Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, the UK, Cargill. We've set up a VAX Champions program where NGOs and private sector can pledge to increase their work in certain specific ways to enhance the VAX initiative. And we have ADM and Bayer and Catholic Relief Services, Concern Worldwide, One Acre Fund, Grow Further, IBM. These these organizations and companies are, we're expanding the list almost every day. We have a great partnership with the CGIAR. We have been in talks with the International Atomic Energy Agency about their Atoms for Food program. In short, we've seen this from the very beginning that that collaboration is really the central part of VAX. It's a vision. It's not something owned and operated by the U.S. government. This is something that other governments and institutions can be involved in. And as such, we don't, the collaborative part of it is a recognition that what we really need to do at the end of the day is change the conversation, change the discourse, to focus the attention, to change the way we analyze and conceive of development projects and food security related projects so that it becomes truly embedded in institutions, in companies, in governments' ways of thinking. And that's what will give it sustainability. So we've taken very much the opposite approach of setting up a project, which we clearly and easily could have done, and gone in the direction of being as collaborative as possible.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, Dr. Fowler. Clearly that vision resonates because it's really remarkable that that VAX was launched less than a year ago, considering the success that you've had, the excitement you generated around it. So thank you for that framing of it. Satu, anything you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, I think VAX is, of course, a great example of building those partnerships, and it's sort of I'm seeing this in many areas. Cary was earlier also talking about links between water and climate, and there are many of these linkages that are kind of self-evident, but yet in the real world, it's often that initiatives don't meet or partners don't meet, and I'm seeing increasingly that understanding. And I think concepts like food systems actually help bring different paths together, because you cannot really, for example, through agriculture, you cannot solve food systems. It's much broader than that. And I think all that these conversations over the past few years, I think, have really opened the eyes of many of us for that kind of collaboration. And then, of course, there's a lot of collaboration that happens at different levels. We had our first experience of doing a joint pavilion at the COP together with FAO, CGIAR, Rockefeller, and ourselves, and it was a good experience. And also, I think the way we were able to engage with both one another, but with different partners, that of course also was an interesting one. So at many levels, I think it's all about bringing very different partners together, and bringing civil society, governments, private sector to work together on these solutions.
Yeah, well, thank you. As we come to a close, I would like to ask one final question of each of you, and I'll start with Noam, and then Satu, and then Dr. Fowler. We can end with you. And this question is based on the outcomes of COP28. What are your hopes for adaptation to agriculture food systems, not just for COP29, but based on our conversations right now, what are your hopes, not just for COP29, but for what will happen between now and COP29? And again, I'll start with Noam.
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing coming out of the negotiations this year on the global goal for adaptation, there is some strong language. There's some decisional language on negotiating around climate finance in advance of COP29. And COP29 has always been intended to be an opportunity to set new quantitative targets through the Paris process. So the Paris process, there was commitment to $100 billion from developed countries towards developing countries for climate finance. And that there's lagging data, but perhaps has only just been met in 2022 or 2023 when it was intended to be by 2020. And the reality is, just for adaptation alone, which is meant to be in balance with the mitigation side of things, there's been a goal to double adaptation finance to $40 billion annually. When studies, there was a sort of the UN Environmental Program has looked at sort of the gap in funding, and the gap is actually much, much larger than that. It's somewhere between sort of 215 and almost $400 billion annually. And so there's a lot of discussion that has to happen on the climate finance side of things. I expect that there will be some very serious negotiating and wrestling with it. And it comes back to this issue that I was talking about earlier of common but differentiated responsibilities. The world that existed at the start of this COP process is not the world that we inhabit today. And the actors are different and the roles that they play on the global stage are different. So China in 1992 is not China in 2023. It plays a very different role on the global stage. And yet there has often been this sort of negotiating block of the G77 and China sort of trying to push, quote unquote, developed countries to finance a lot of the climate work, which in many ways is their responsibility given historic contribution to the challenge that we face. And yet you saw in this COP that the first country to jump in and support financially the loss and damage, the climate impact fund was the UAE, right? Not part of that traditional developed country group. And I think that we should expect and push and hope to see more of that as we try to resolve some of these really thorny climate finance issues. And I hope and expect that climate adaptation issues, including all of the issues that we're describing here with regard to food systems, food security, agriculture, climate resilient agriculture in particular, and smallholder farmers, will be increasingly sort of loud on the global stage at this next COP and the following.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Noam. Satu, over to you.
I'll just really start where Noam finished. It's really what we expect to engage on and will continue pushing on is really that perspective of resilient agriculture, rural development, and smallholder agriculture, because even if it has somehow made it to the COP negotiations, it's still not really strongly enough reflected in those conversations. And we see that, financing for smallholder agriculture within the climate finance dropped by 44% since it was in the past couple of years, and that's completely the wrong direction. So we do need to kind of really push strongly for this voice to be heard, and for this to be part of it. And the other side that what we expect to or hope to see before the next COP is also in sort of our realities in terms of our resource mobilization and being able to capture some adaptation finance that countries are making available to our tools, and then get it to the smallholder agriculture space. So we hope that by the next COP will be our coffers will be more full of that, and that we can then be proud of programming that and delivering it too, including some private sector finance.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Fowler, host for COP29, and what will happen between now and COP29?
Sure, thanks. Well, the United States has allocated or pledged a great deal of funding for work in this area, and specifically even for the vision for adapted crops and soils. That work is already started. So we're seeing more work on soil mapping and analytics and modeling that can help governments make wise decisions about land use. Farmers make wise decisions about crops to plant and how to manage those crops. That's underway as we talk. We've also seen 181 metric tons of drought-tolerant maize go into Southern Africa, just as Southern Africa in places is beginning to feel the drought effects of the El Nino. I think all of these kinds of activities that we're seeing in the field really represent a proof of concept, and will be seen to be successful, I believe, and that will, I hope, generate more funding and more activity. Obviously, we'd love to see more support for the fund that IFAD established for this purpose. We'll be out beating the bushes and encouraging countries to contribute to that. And then looking forward, we have Italy taking over the presidency of the G7, it being handed off from Japan. Japan did a wonderful job in stressing the fundamentals of good soils and adapted crops. Italy, I know, is going to highlight that in its work on the G7. So there are a number of processes that are going to unfold in the next year that allow us to keep the focus on these issues, raise awareness, and hopefully mobilize and encourage more action.
Thank you. Well, that's a great and a hopeful place to end this conversation. With this, I'd like to thank especially our panelists, Cary Fowler, Satu, Santala, and Noam Unger, and your teams. So thank you for participating, and thank you for the support of your teams. Thanks to you and IFAD, especially Gabe Lazier, for your strong partnership in today's event. Thanks to CSIS's outstanding external relations team, including Dinesh Matani, Chi Yu, Eric Ruditsky, and Theo Mitchell. And finally, thanks to my own programs, Anita Kirschenbaum and Lucy Terry, for excellent support in today's event. Lastly, to our audience, this is our final public event for 2023. Thank you for joining us throughout this year, online and in person. We look forward to engaging with you in 2024, and we wish you and your loved ones a happy holiday season. Thanks for tuning in.
And thanks to you, Caitlin.
Yeah,
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.